All right. Give a minute for everyone to be able to connect in. All right, well, thanks everyone for joining us today. Wanted to go through a little bit of the past community news real quick with you before we get started today. Mike, is it in presenter mode and advancing properly?
Yes, it is.
Perfect. All right, if you want to go ahead and start the recording.
Okay, I've got it started.
Perfect. All right. Well, again, welcome everyone. Before we get started, wanted to go through a couple things. One is if you're planning to go to the PASS Summit and you haven't done so yet, haven't registered yet, and you're looking for a discount code, please use the discount code for the PASS PowerShell virtual chapter, which is on the screen right now. It's also an email that you received today. That'll save you $150, and if we get enough registrations with that code, it'll do something good for the chapter. Next, 24 hours of PASS coming up again soon. I'm going to be moderating a couple sessions, and the cool thing about this one is that it is all for new speakers who have not done 24 hours of PASS before, and so we're getting some new community voices involved. Just a quick reminder, besides the PowerShell virtual chapter, there's lots of other chapters out there. Definitely encourage you to check them out. Some of them are by discipline, and some of them are by language. So here's the latest list that I have of them. Here are some of these virtual chapter meetings that are coming up, and I'd like to point out that just like us, several of these chapters record their meetings and post it to their YouTube channel. So even if you already missed the meeting in the past, you can probably go back and find it on their YouTube channel. A couple SQL Saturdays coming up to highlight. Chattanooga, I'll be speaking at that one. And Vancouver, North America. Bratislava, I hope I pronounced that right, and I'm guessing Ika over there. I think they're both in Europe, but I could be wrong. And finally, they want us to remind you to update your volunteer profile if you're interested in volunteering with the PASS organization. We can certainly use more volunteers. And with that all said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mike. Mike is a PowerShell MVP, and Mike did a similar version of this session a couple of years ago for the PowerShell virtual chapter, and we posted that to our YouTube channel earlier this week, so that's out there for you to be able to grab. And the recording today will be posted next Monday, so as to minimize the number of emails that you get from YouTube from us in a week. And I believe all the code and slides will be available as well. And without further ado, Mike, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, I sure will. Thank you, Aaron. Okay, should be able to see my screen now.
Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and mute out and let you take it from here.
Thank you, Aaron. Okay, this presentation is on getting started with PowerShell for SQL Server. So really it's designed for people who are just getting started with PowerShell, so it's a beginner level session. It's certainly not a deep dive into PowerShell or SQL Server. But I've got some tricks here that hopefully will be something new that you haven't seen before. So even if you've been using PowerShell for a while, it'll be something new for everybody. Okay, so as Aaron said, I'm a Microsoft MVP on Windows PowerShell. I'm also a Sapien Technologies MVP, leader and co-founder of the Mississippi PowerShell user group, co-author of Windows PowerShell TFM 4th edition, and author of Chapter 6 in the PowerShell Deep Dives book and winner of the Advanced category from the 2013 Scripting Games. Let's talk about a little bit about what we'll cover in this session. We'll talk about basics, discoverability, objects, methods, properties, and even though we're going to be talking about methods and properties, you don't have to be a developer to use PowerShell. It's actually designed for system administrators, but it's used by developers and IT pros. So we'll talk about the pipeline, talk about extending PowerShell, briefly talk about remoting, briefly throw in some best practices here and there, and of course we've got to talk about SQL Server. So what is PowerShell? Microsoft TechNet provides a great definition for PowerShell, and it's a task-based command line shell and scripting language designed especially for system administration, and that's where my comment about being designed for system administrators came from. So supported PowerShell versions by operating system. What I want you to notice on this, and I've dropped Windows XP off of this since it's no longer supported, and coming up next month, Server 2003 will no longer be supported either. So once Server 2003 is off the list, then the only operating system that'll be only be able to run PowerShell version 2 will be Vista. So the 3 people who are running Vista will only be able to run PowerShell version 2. And then Server 2008 can run 3, and everything else can run version 4. And you can see the default version is older. And of course, before you update the version of PowerShell on your machine, you should test it. You should test anytime. A lot of times vendors will tell you not to update the version of PowerShell on your machine, but sometimes they don't care about the version of PowerShell. It's because a specific version of the .NET framework is required for every version of PowerShell. So what they actually mean is a lot of times they mean they don't want the .NET framework updated. Also notice the default execution policy beginning with Server 2012 R2 is remote signed, and beginning with Server 2012, the remoting is enabled by default. So you no longer have to worry about enabling PowerShell remoting with Server 2012 and 2012 R2. Okay, so if you're brand new with PowerShell, how do you start it? So Windows 7 Server 2008 R2 and prior operating systems, it's in the start menu, and this is from a 64-bit machine. I recommend using the 64-bit shortcuts unless you run into a snap-in or module that has problems with the 64-bit version. But in all the years I've been running PowerShell, I've never had an issue with that. Normally 32-bit snap-ins and modules will run fine in the 64-bit version of PowerShell. So if you've got Windows 8 and Server 2012 and higher, PowerShell is accessed from the start screen. You just go to the start screen, which I believe used to be called the Metro interface. Start typing the word PowerShell. It'll find it for you. So background information, PowerShell commands are called commandlets, and it's pronounced commandlet, not cmdlet. So commandlets are in the form of singular verb-noun commands. It's very important to run PowerShell as a local administrator. When you open PowerShell, you're actually running it elevated because it's not able to participate in user access control. Now that you have to do that to update the help for PowerShell or do things like stop or start a service on your local computer. But if you don't have local admin permissions, it's not required to run something remotely against a remote machine. It's really only required if you're doing something that requires elevated privileges to do that, and I'll demonstrate that. So starting with PowerShell version 3, you've got updatable help. So the first time you try to get help on a command, it's going to say, hey, do you want to update the help system? Because help no longer ships in box. It just ships with very basic information, and the help is periodically updated. So you do want to run the update help commandlet to update your help periodically. Okay, so one of the questions I always get from people who are just getting started with PowerShell is how do I figure out what the commands are? So there's 3 core commands for discovering how to use PowerShell. That's get command, and the way I use it, that's the command I use to find what commands are available. Now there's some overlap between get command and get help, but I use get help to figure out how to use commands once I find the command. And then get member helps you discover objects, properties, and methods. So how do I get the SQL Server module with the SQL commandlets for managing SQL Server? And this is showing SQL 2014. It's actually installed with the basic management tools. And I would think if you're a DBA, then you probably have at least the basic management tools installed on your management workstation or on your workstation, or at least a jump server. Because what I really recommend is managing from your desktop, because even in the demo environment I have server core for the operating system, so there's no GUI on the servers themselves. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into the demo. You can see here in the screenshot, there's actually 57 commandlets, SQL, and you also get a SQL Analysis Services module that's installed, but there's 57 commandlets now, and that's with SQL 2014, but with 2008 R2, there were only like a half dozen commandlets, and I actually have a SQL 2008 R2 and a 2014 demo box that I'll be showing. Okay, so let's pull up our VM. Let's see. Okay, so we're on a machine called PC10, and PowerShell's never been run on this machine at all. So what you want to do is go to the start screen, start typing in PowerShell. And if you run PowerShell just by clicking on it, even though I'm a local administrator, it's going to run it as a non-admin. We'll go ahead and bump the font up. We're not going to spend a lot of time in the console. We'll spend most of our time in the integrated scripting environment. Okay, so notice the title bar does not say administrator. So what I will do, I can get service, get the bit service, and I want to stop that service. And notice I just pressed tab and I was tabbing through the commands until I found the one I wanted. So you don't have to type everything. And it would also correct the case. So if I started typing service, I can just hit tab and it'll fix that for me. So if it doesn't tab expand, you probably typed something wrong. But there are certain places in PowerShell where tabbed expansion and IntelliSense doesn't work. So if I try to stop the service, I'm going to get an error. And what I would recommend is always read the error message, because usually it will give you a meaningful error, but this one does not. So what I need to do is actually run PowerShell in an elevated prompt. So I go back to the start screen, start typing in PowerShell. And what I generally like to do, I could actually say run as administrator, but I like to pin it to the taskbar. I'll go back to the desktop. You'll notice it's pinned to the taskbar. I'll hold down Shift, I'll right click, select Properties, go to Advanced, and click the Run as Administrator check mark. And that'll make it always run as administrator, so I'll never get deep into a command and then find out that, hey, I didn't run PowerShell as an administrator. So I only ran a couple of commands there, but you can actually press F7 to pull up the previous commands. So if I ran my get service command again, and name is a parameter, and bits, you can actually tab expand through the values as well. And that was either added in PowerShell 3 or 4. So if I run that command and I pressed F7, you could see I could go back to one of those commands and actually run that command. But what we want to do is go ahead and launch the PowerShell ISE, or the integrated scripting environment. And there's an alias ISE, so I can just type in ISE in the PowerShell console. It'll start the PowerShell ISE. Okay. There's actually a little down arrow here. We're going to bump our font up, be one of the first things we'll do because the font's very small by default with this high resolution. I'll close this command window. And I have a script I actually want to paste in here. As I said, we'll bump our font up. I had some reminders. I actually have a script here. It's heavily commented, so I'll provide this. So I think we probably need to go up to about 175 for this demo. So you can do that with the little slider over here, or you can actually do it with PowerShell. So there's no reason to do it with pointing and clicking in the GUI if you can do it with PowerShell. Okay, so I've got an example of a multi-line comment. It's actually angle braces, pound symbol, or it's also known as a hash symbol or octothorpe. And you get the idea. And I've tabbed the comments in. That's not required, but just so you could see the comment lines better. There's multiple VMs that we're using in this environment. We'll go ahead and set our location to the demo folder, and we're done with that portion of the that region. And I've broken my code down into regions, and Control M actually contracts and expands those regions. So you can see they're all contracted right now. So before we begin, so one of the first things you want to know when you start PowerShell is what version of PowerShell am I running? There's an automatic variable called PS version table. And you can see I'm actually running PS version 4.0. Now I'll typically add this .ps version to the end of the automatic variable because it gives me a more concise view of what PowerShell version I'm running. So if that doesn't work, you've got PowerShell version 1 you need to update. I recommend 4 if you can run it. If you can't, 3 is almost as good. It has almost DSC, desired state configuration, was the big enhancement to PowerShell version 4. But if you actually open up the integrated scripting environment and you have 3 panes by default that are all have a white background, then you actually have PowerShell version 2. That's another way to know. But anyway, the newer versions of PowerShell are distributed as part of the Windows Management Framework. And you do need a specific version of the full version of the .NET framework, which I believe I've already mentioned. And that'll be, just read the documentation that comes with the WMF framework. It'll tell you the prerequisites. Okay, so let's talk about execution policy. So execution policy, the default on, of course, this is a Windows 8.1 machine, so the default execution policy is restricted. If I wanted to do something like import the SQL PS module, then it won't even import with the execution policy being set to restricted. Let's create a little script here. And this is I just want multiple lines, so I'm just going to store a list of services in a variable and then output that. So that's all it does, nothing fancy. So we'll save that. And we'll put it in our demo folder, and we'll call it services. So now we can select all the code in here and we can run it, and it appears to run fine. But when I try to run all, I'll get an error message. And because that's actually running it as a script. And it's no different than if I went to my demo folder here. If I start typing in services, I can hit tab. It'll put everything I need there, the slash or the ./ and the PS1 on the end of it. So, and it tells me, like I said, meaningful error message. It tells me that the execution policy is running of scripts is disabled on the system. So what I need to do and what I recommend is remote sign for the execution policy, since that's what Microsoft has moved to with Server 2012 R2. So I'll go ahead and run that. It tells you there's security risk with setting this. I'll show you how to read more about that. Now, if you still run into an issue where you have problems with execution policy, there's actually several different execution policies. and you can add the list parameter to that command, and you can see there's actually a user policy, a machine policy, a process, and current user. If you're not an admin, you may not have rights to set the local machine one, but if it's undefined, then you can probably set the current user and possibly still be able to run scripts. But it's not something I've tested either. So let's talk a little bit about discoverability, and this has to do with how do I figure out what the commands are. We're going to move through this fairly quickly because, as Aaron said, I have a previous video that's on the PowerShell virtual chapter of PASS YouTube site, and I've got a link to that video in this article that'll drill down for a whole hour into these 3 commands. So the first time you're going to run get help on a command, so what I'm trying to do, I'm running get help and name as a parameter, and get command is actually the value I provided for that parameter. So I'm trying to get help. I'm trying to learn how to use get command. So it's going to say, hey, do you want to run update help? And you only get this like the first time you ever run this on a machine that you've never run get help on. So I'm going to say no because this VM is not connected to the internet. And what I've previously done is I've saved the help. So if you have a machine that's not connected to the internet, you can use the save help commandlet to save the help to like a local repository, or a file share is what it really is. And then you can actually run update help and give it a source path. So we'll go ahead and do that. So we'll update our help. Okay, and one thing I want you to notice with the previous command, it'll tell you here, it says, get help cannot find the help files for this commandlet on this computer. So that gives you an idea that, hey, there's an issue. But if I go back now, I run the same command again, it'll give me a lot more information. So pretty much everything you want to know about PowerShell is in the help system. What I typically do with newer versions of PowerShell, I believe show window was added with 3, could have been 4. But I'll typically use show window. And what I did there, I actually highlighted part of the command and ran it. So of course that'll generate an error message. You can have your cursor on a line and actually run, and it'll run that entire line of code without having to select the code. And the other benefit of this view is I can also zoom in, but I have multiple monitors, so this window is not tying up my command prompt. So I can drag this over to an alternate monitor, and I can be looking at the help without, and still be able to work in PowerShell. That's one of the reasons I really like that view. I want to look at that one more time. And notice it remembered the zoom that we had. We've actually got 6 different parameter sets, and each one of these parameter sets has got at least one parameter that's mutually exclusive to the other ones, meaning this one has full and this one has detailed. So I can't use full and detailed in the same command. And all this square brackets, they all mean something, and the other video we referenced, it's got more detail about that, because that's something that it's hard to remember. Once you figure it out, it's actually fairly easy, and the details of that can also be found in each parameter, but if you have to scroll down through tons of parameters, it takes a little more time than just looking at the syntax portion. Okay, so help is a function that pipes get help to more.exe, but in the integrated scripting environment, it works just like help. So and help is not an alias, it's a function, because man is another command that's an alias to help. But you'll typically see me type in help, and then name is a positional parameter, so I'll omit name, and I'll just say like help get member and then show command, or show window. So that'll bring up the same thing, and it's just a little shortcut. So then One thing I want to show you also is maybe you've got a script. It might be somebody's script that's like 500 lines long. You see a command in there that you're not used to seeing. You can put the cursor just behind the command or highlight just the command. So I'll put it just behind the command. You can press F1 and that'll actually bring up the show window version of help without having to go and key all that stuff in. So it's kind of a little shortcut that'll help you out. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about aliases, and if you're going to share code, don't use aliases. And I also talked about positional parameters. Don't use positional parameters in code that you're going to share. It's okay if you use it in a one-liner because typically you'll type it in and in the console is where they're normally used. You'll close out the console, the code's gone, nobody ever sees it, so that's fine. So I'll run this command. This shows a few common aliases that I even use. So there's an alias for get command, there's an alias for get member, and there's an alias for help, but generally I'll just use help. So, and even if, you know, typically you'll see online that aliases are acceptable in one-liners. But what I would add to that is if you're sharing the one-liner, then you still need to use full commandlet names and parameter names. Okay, so you can run help about underscore star, and there's all these help about topics. So there's like a whole encyclopedia set of documentation inside PowerShell. We modified our execution policy earlier. So if we want to learn more about that, we can say help about execution policies, show window, and that's one of the commands in this list. So that'll bring this up. It'll tell us about restricted. It'll tell us about remote signed, and it'll tell us what it will run and what it won't run, and so on. So, so if you want to learn more about PowerShell, the about help topics is a good place to start. So maybe you're used to using the graphical user interface. Show command is a command that was introduced in PowerShell 3 or 4, a newer version. But you can run this, it'll bring up a little GUI. And what you can do is, I'll show you in this console window, that if I type in telnet /?, by default, of course, on newer operating systems, the telnet client is not installed by default. So we'll jump back to this little show command window, and it's also the little command bar that was on the right-hand side when we started. I know this font's really small, and unfortunately in this window there's not a way to make it larger. So if I start typing in a command name, it'll actually find a command. So I can enable Windows optional feature. It's a command that exists on desktop operating systems, and it's similar to on servers. There's an enable Windows feature, but this is part of the DISM module, and this exists on desktops and servers. So what I can do is show details. I want to use the online parameter, and feature name, I know it just happens to be called the telnet client. So I can either copy that command or run it. So I can just click run here. You'll notice it's running that command without me typing any PowerShell whatsoever. And that'll finish here in just a second. Do we have any questions so far?
No, you're doing good on questions so far.
Okay, so now if I go back to my my PowerShell console, I can see I just installed the telnet client on this machine. With PowerShell remoting, if I wanted to, I could install that on every machine in our domain. Okay, so what you can also do is a similar trick to looking at the help with putting a cursor at the end of a command or highlighting a command. You can put it at the end of a command, and I'll just do it with this command that's got more typed in. I can actually hit Control F1. That'll bring that command up in the show window interface automatically. So you can see it's already got Windows optional feature in there. And then I can actually work on that command in the show window interface. So it's a little trick if you're looking at somebody else's script, that how else can I use this command? Okay, so there's a link here to that video that was posted, I believe it was earlier this week or maybe last week. It's PowerShell Fundamentals for Beginners. It's a presentation I did a couple of years ago. So I'll go ahead and collapse this region. We'll talk about the pipeline a little bit. And I know that at least so far this is not SQL related. We will get to some SQL content, but the basics, that's the awesome thing about PowerShell. It doesn't matter if you're an AD guy or Exchange guy or SQL guy. Even in our data centers, we have equal logic storage area networks that have PowerShell commandlets, and I provision our storage with PowerShell. So it doesn't matter, the basics are all the same. So if you're a SQL guy and you need to go do something on something else with PowerShell, you can figure it out fairly easily. So what I've done with this command is I've actually returned one service, the Windows time service. There's only like three different properties that were returned. Well, with a lot of PowerShell commands, there's a default view, you might say, and there's a lot more information that exists behind the scenes, and you can use getMember to see that information. So you can see there are several different properties here. There's also methods, and methods are something you would take action on that service. So I could actually stop the service or start the service, and I know there's a commandlet like stop service and start service, but you may run into a commandlet that doesn't have a corresponding commandlet to take the action you want to take, and there could be a method, and I'll demonstrate that. So if you want to see the values of all these properties, what you can do is actually pipe that command to format list and property star. And you'll see these commands shortcutted, on the internet because there are shorter versions of this, but the readability is kind of compromised. So now you can see there's a number of different, I can see, can I pause and continue the service? Can I stop it? Can I shut it down? And so on. So there's a lot more properties. And I know I've also worked with the SharePoint commandlets, and the SharePoint commandlets, there's like tons of properties. There'll be like, it seems like 100 properties, and they only show like maybe 2 or 3 by default. So sometimes you have to use the force parameter. So PowerShell's got what's called profiles, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on profiles, but this would be the profile that would run for the PowerShell ISC. So if I wanted to put something in there and run it by default, if I wanted to set my location to a certain folder, clear the screen, or so on, I could do that. Well, I'll send profile to format list property star. Well, guess what? It didn't show me any more information. Well, I can use the force parameter because sometimes you just have to force things. And I can see there's several different profiles. So it'll tell me there's all users, there's a current host, there's current user, there's a current user all host. And there's actually 6 different profiles by default, because if you run the same command in the PowerShell console, 2 of the profiles will be different. So if I ran the same command here, 2 of these will be different. But what I wanted you to see is sometimes you will have to use force to see all the properties that exist. That's the moral of the story. So let's get back to the pipeline. So when I ran this command getMember and piped it to getMember, one of the most important things here that I didn't show you to start with is it produces a service controller object. So you'll see the type name is a service controller. So what I want to know is what commands accept a service controller object. So getCommand has a parameter to tell me that information. So I can say getCommand parameter type service controller. So all these it have parameters that accept service controller objects. Now that doesn't mean it accepts it via pipeline input. Like if you ran the same command and got a list of all the commands that accepted a string, not all of those accept it via pipeline input. There's several different ways, but for somebody new to PowerShell, the easiest way to find that information to make sure it accepts it via pipeline input is to take one of these commands and look at the help. So what I'll do, I'll come down here, I'll notice this is the one that's set. Yes, sir.
Sorry to interrupt you, just wanted to let you know we got a question or two in the queue whenever you get a minute.
Okay, let's go ahead and cover them now.
Go ahead and finish your thought there, and I've assigned one of them to you right now if you can see it. Max Scott had a question he wanted clarification for around the execution policy. Is it different between the command prompt and the ISE?
Okay, and I'm not really sure I understand the question, but if you set the execution policy in one, it actually sets it in the other. So when I set it in, even though I have it closed and reopened the console, it is set to remote signed. If I do a list, there's actually not a different one for the ISE or the console. There are different ones for like the current user and current process, and there's a user and machine policy one, but no difference between the ISE and console. So once I set it on local machine, even if I close this out, it'll still be set to the same policy that it's assigned to.
Great, thanks, Mike.
Okay, so you'll notice I was able to go back to, it's kind of like I mentioned earlier, having multiple screens. So I was able to go back to the coding view, and then I can jump back to the help again. So, you know, when you're generally looking at help, you're tying up your console or your ISE if you're not using show window. Okay, so where we were at is we wanted to find objects that accept a service controller. So we can see input object accepts a service controller, and it accepts it by pipeline, or yeah, accept pipeline input. So it does accept it by pipeline, but specifically by value. So what that means is it's going to accept the service controllers. It doesn't care what the name of the property is. If it comes through as, and the name of it is Mike or Aaron or whatever, if it's a service controller, it's going to bind it to this property when it comes through the pipeline. And I'll show you an example of that. So this is actually by value, by service controller, and even if there's two different ways that it can bind, and I'll show you a second way here in a second. So there's also, I've combined a few things here. There's a what if parameter you can use. So what I've done is actually sent the services, bits, and the Windows time service through the pipeline to stop service. And I used what if because if you're making something that's doing system level changes, I recommend using the what if parameter, and most commandlets that do make changes support it because it can save your job. If you pipe all the services on the box to stop service on a production SQL server, that's probably not going to be a good day. And if you use the what if parameter, you can see that, oh, that's not really what I meant to do. It's kind of like doing an update or a delete in SQL and forgetting, to say where, whatever, and you delete everything. Also, most commandlets that support what if support confirm. So it'll go through and say, are you sure you want to stop this service? No. Are you sure you want to stop this other service? And I can say no to all. We'll talk about by value, and this is a string. If we go back to the help, there was another commandlet that, or not another commandlet, another parameter that accepts pipeline input. And this one accepts it by property name and by value. Now, by value is always the first method it tries. And if it can't bind to anything by value, it'll try to bind by property name. And we're just kind of hitting over this high level, not a deep dive into the pipeline either. Just wanted to really make you aware that this is kind of how it works. And once you start working with this, you'll get the feel of it better, So anyway, so if something comes through as a service controller, regardless of name, it goes to input object. If something comes through as a string, it doesn't matter. You can pipe get process to stop service. And because get process has a name, it will try to bind all those process names to this name parameter of stop service. And if you happen to have a a process name that matches the service name, it'll stop it. Otherwise, your screen will be bleeding red. So now we'll send something through the pipeline as a string. So you'll notice I have a collection or array of strings here, and when I send that to get member, and I look at the type of object it produces, it's a system.string, and typically you would just say it's a string. So I'll send that to stop service. It'll bind it with no problem, and I also specified what if. Okay, so plan B is by property name. So we'll create a new object. We'll take a look at what's in that object. We've actually, the name is name, and W32 time and bits are the two values that we have in there. So if we pipe that to get member, we can see it's a PS custom object. So it's not a string and it's not a service controller. So if I send that to stop service, it'll actually work. Now if I take this and I put, like, let's just say these were process names. So if we call that process name, we look at the object, nothing's changed except for the name of process name. We send that to get member, we can see it's a PS custom object. Well, guess what? It's not going to work this time because it's going to try to bind by value, and this is not a string, it's not a service controller. So then it's going to try to bind by property name, and there's no property names of name. So when I try that, of course, I get an error message. So that's how by property name works. Okay, so figuring out objects and properties and methods. When I run stop service bits, and I'll actually go ahead and really stop it this time, it didn't produce any output. So there's a number of commandlets that don't produce output. If I take one of those commandlets and try to send it to get member, guess what? It's going to generate an error message because you can only send commands that produce objects to get member. Now, a number of commands that don't produce output have what's called a pass-through parameter, which means it will pass the objects through the pipeline. So I could specify the pass-through parameter and then pipe it to get member, and then see what type of object it produces, and see the properties and the methods. Okay, there's a misconception that a lot of people have that says, I'm going to let you run get commandlets that start with get, and they think it's like a select statement in SQL. So run like get the Windows time service, and it's actually running. So I can call a method on that service and stop the service. So I just stopped it without ever calling the stop service commandlet. I can also start it. So I took action on that object or on that service. So I was able to stop and start the service. Okay, I am going to jump to another VM at this point. And do we have any more questions, Aaron?
Yep, we've got some in the queue for you.
Okay.
I assigned them to you if you're able to see them. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I can see them. The window is really, really small.
Yeah, welcome to my world. And I don't know why they don't let us make it bigger. Oh, you can pop it out, but that's it.
Okay, yeah, that'll help. I've got multiple monitors, so maybe that'll work. Okay, here we go. Let's answer a few questions at this point. No PowerShell version 5 in this session. I've done some other stuff on PowerShell 5. I actually presented a session at the PowerShell Summit this year in Charlotte on PowerShell 5. And I've also presented a number of sessions on what's new in PowerShell 5, but that's kind of a moving target. But what I wanted to present today was what you could use, in your production environment today. You could go home with, but of course, test it before you use it in production. Let's see, just going through the questions real quick here. Okay, I just saw the one on execution policy. We'll come back to a few questions here in a minute. Okay, and the good thing about regions also, this is the same prep that I ran on the other machine, but what I could actually do is actually just run the selection and it'll run the entire prep. So we're going to bump this one also up to 175. So it's a little bit larger. Okay, so how do I run commands against SQL and PowerShell? Of course, you need the SQL PS module that I've already covered how to get that. If you run get module, and I've actually already added the SQL PS module, I am going to remove that. So if I run remove module SQL PS, it'll actually remove it. Now I will tell you that SQL will change your actual location. And if you're in the SQL Server PS drive and you try to remove it, you'll get an error because it's in use, of course. Okay. So right now I don't have the SQL commandlets loaded. The SQL analysis service is still loaded, and that's fine. So what you can run is get module list available, and it will show you all the commands, all the modules that are actually installed on your machine that exist in the PS module path. And these are the ones that are not necessarily loaded. To see the ones that are currently loaded, you would run just get module. So there's only a fraction of the ones loaded. Now starting with PowerShell version 3, if I use a commandlet in any of those modules, it will auto load the module. That functionality does not work with snap-ins. So even if you have something in a comment, which this is a single line comment, I can actually highlight that command and still run that command. So if you have something that's going to run that's going to be really dangerous and you don't want somebody to accidentally run the entire script, unless you're going to put break or something at the top of your script, you could comment it out and then just select it and run it. Okay, this is not a very pretty formatted output here, so I'll just split it on the semicolon so we can see what paths that these modules would have to exist in. When the SQL PS module is installed, it does add a path to this this environment variable. So to import the SQL PS module, I could use a command like I previously said, or I could just import the module. So I'll go ahead and import the module. And this will take just a second. Now, one thing I will tell you, if you start using SQL SMO, SQL Server Management Objects, the DLLs that need to be imported are actually imported with this command. Now, if you have an older version like 2008 R2, when you import the snap-in, it's not imported. And if you want to use SMO, you actually have to add the DLLs manually. You'll notice you get this error message. It changes your location. There's some ways to work around that, like a push and pop location are a couple of the things I'll use. So I'm going to go ahead and set my location back to the demo folder. A lot of people freak out about this warning. There's a couple of commandlets that don't use approved verbs, and they don't understand why this happens. The reason this happens is back in the snap-in days, they didn't check for approved verbs. So there's I believe it's encode and decode are the two verbs that two of the SQL commands are using. So when they move to a module, they just have the existing commandlets, and now that's being checked. But what the SQL team could do if they wanted to is rename the commands and use approved verbs, and then alias the old commands with aliases, and that would make them backwards compatible while making them meet the requirements. But that's a subject for another day. So how do I figure out what the commands are in that module? So I can run get command module SQL PS. I can see these are all the commands. There's like 50 something of them. Well, actually, there's not 50 something of these because these are only the SQL PS ones. If I say SQL star because wildcards are supported with that parameter, I can see there's several SQL analysis services commandlets that were added, and there's total SQL commandlets, there's 50 something. Okay, so we're going to jump to remoting real quick. We're going to enter a one-to-one remoting session to our SQL 02 server. We're going to change our location. We're going to look at the, we're actually going to return just the computer name to make sure we're in the right computer. So this has SQL 2008 R2. If I run get PS snap-in, you'll notice there's a number of snap-ins loaded, but not the SQL ones. So I can see other modules that are loaded, but that are available to be imported. And instead of the import verb, they actually use the add verb. so it's a little bit different. So I can use add PS snap-in name SQL Server star, because there's two snap-ins. There's a provider and one with commandlets. Same command to see what commandlets exist. I can see there's only 5 commandlets, and this encode and decode SQL name are the couple I was talking about, the reason you get the message. So I just wanted to show you the difference. You can see they've gone from like 5 commands to 50 something. So even the SQL team is heavily invested in PowerShell. So we'll exit that command, or exit that one-to-one remoting session. Okay, so one-to-many remoting is performed with the invoke command commandlet. And I'll just do something simple here. I can run any command in this that exists on the target machines. I'm checking the PowerShell version on SQL 02, 04, and DC 01, which are 3 servers. Okay, looks like we've only got a few more minutes here. So, you know, if you've got existing T-SQL code, you can easily run that inside PowerShell. There's really 4 different ways you can access a SQL Server with PowerShell. One's with invoke SQL command using your existing Transact SQL. You can also run, the same way you can run Transact SQL, you can run stored procedures. Now, one issue is if stored procedure such as SP-Hutu, it has 2 columns that the column name is SPID. So PowerShell converts that to objects, and it can have 2 objects with the same name. So of course that one will generate an error message. That's not really a problem. We can just write our own. We can just use SMO in this scenario, and we'll just write our own SP-Hutu in a simple command. And what I would recommend also is when you start writing PowerShell, you don't want 50,000 scripts that do the same thing with a different server name hard-coded in it. There's ways, and we will not cover it in this session, but write your commands so they're dynamic. They take parameters. You can parameterize the computer name. So there's also what's called PowerShell providers. And it's where you can work with PowerShell as if it were a file system. So you can see there's a number of drives, is what I call them. So I can get a list of databases from one of my SQL servers as if it were a file system, because dir is an alias for get child item. There's also an environment drive that shows all the environment variables. So if you're going to hard code something in a script, such as the computer name, consider using an environment variable if you're wanting the local computer name. There's also a drive for all the variables. So if you define a variable, or any of the default variables will show up there. Okay, so as we saw, there's like 50-something commands now. So the ways to use PowerShell to access your SQL Server is through the invoke SQL commandlet using your existing Transact SQL, through the provider, through SQL management objects, and also through those commandlets. And not really all those commandlets are. I mean, I can't see the code, but it's probably just wrappers on top of SMO or something else. Okay, so what we're going to do now, so what can you do with all this? Comes a lot of what I've shown, sure, you can do it in SQL. So we have an OU in Active Directory. There's nothing in this AdventureWorks OU. So we're going to go ahead and import our Active Directory module, and I know the SQL one's already imported, so it won't re-import it. If I did want to force a re-import, there's a force parameter. So you don't have to remove and re-add the SQL PS module. You can just import it with a force parameter. And that Active Directory module will take just a second there. So we're actually going to query the AdventureWorks database. We're going to do several joins, and I'll show you the output that I will get. So there's actually 290 users that exist in the AdventureWorks database. And for the purposes of this, let's just pretend that's our HR database. Maybe we've merged with another company. We can see this OU in Active Directory has 0 users. So what I'm going to do, I'm not only going to create 290 Active Directory user accounts from the AdventureWorks database, I'm going to measure the command and see how long it takes to create them. Okay, so it took 2 seconds. So now if we query that Active Directory OU again, you can see there's 290 Active Directory user accounts. We'll go over here, we'll do a refresh. Not only did we create 290 Active Directory user accounts, we filled in their name, their display name, their telephone number. We filled in their address, and we filled in their job title. And it's all 100% accurate based on the information in the AdventureWorks database. So yeah, try to get some temps to do that accurately. So that's kind of the power of PowerShell. And at this point, let's see, I want to jump back to my slide deck. I've got a couple of resource slides, and then if we have any time, we'll take questions. And if I don't have time for your question, I've got a resource slide that's got my Twitter handle and LinkedIn and so on. Just hit me up. I take questions offline. Okay, so resources for learning PowerShell, or even to get help if you're an experienced PowerShell scripter. Blogs is one of the main things I'll use. There's a number of blogs that guys that I feel write really good PowerShell code, but that's opinionated. So if you go to my blog, I have a blog roll, and it's people that are consistently writing blogs like every month or every week or whatever, and it's high quality code. Also user groups. I run the Mississippi PowerShell user group. We have videos very similar to this. PowerShell.org, they have awesome forums. So if you have questions, even they could get to the question faster than probably you could even send me an email. PowerShell Magazine is another great site. The Hey Scripting Guy blog, I've written some guest blog articles for all three of these places. Is great. The Microsoft Virtual Academy, they have some great videos on PowerShell. I'm sure they probably have some on SQL Server as well, but I've seen the PowerShell ones. They're free. Everything I mentioned so far is free. The Pluralsight ones it's a paid subscription. So if you're interested in even more videos, I would go there. And there's a community really getting started on GitHub. Microsoft has put a lot of their DSC resources on GitHub, and I've actually fixed even the SQL Server one. If you didn't specify like whatever you wanted to, any options for SQL Server in uppercase, it would actually give you an error. So I did a pull request, and actually did I forked the repository, and then I fixed the code, and then I did a pull request. So if you go download the DSC resource that's the SQL Server one, you'll get some code that I've written, and I even put a comment in there. So this is my resource slide, and this should be the last slide. So my blog is yes, sir.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
MikeFrobbins.com, or you can get there by MrPowerShell.com. You find me on Twitter, LinkedIn. If you want my email, there's a security riddle on my About page, and then also the Mississippi PowerShell user group can be found with mspowershell.com, and I've got the pictures of the books that I've contributed to there.
All right, great. Thanks, Mike. We've got some questions in the queue if you want to take them real quick.
Sure.
Just assign one to you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see how you assign them now.
Yep.
Yeah, that's correct. Well, I see. Actually, it looks like you answered some of these.
Yep. See the one with the little flag?
Yeah, sure do. So invoke SQL command. How do you make sure the connection gets closed? I don't know the official answer to that off the top of my head, but I can tell you how to force it closed. If you close PowerShell, it's going to close the connection. So if you had a script that you ran with something like a scheduled task for some reason, when it finished, it would close PowerShell and it would close the connection. But I don't, generally when I'm working interactively with SQL Server, closing the connection is something that I haven't been as concerned with. Let's see. Let's check any of the other ones with see if I have any others.
There's some questions about, are the scripts going to be available, things like that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. what I did, I don't know if you, I'm sure you saw that these are heavily commented, and I did that so that you could put the script in perspective when I provided it. So what I'll provide is a PDF of the slides, and then I'll also provide 2 scripts and from both the machines, and it'll all be in a zip file, and I'll give it to Aaron. And what I'll probably do is I typically publish a blog with the content as well. So when he publishes the video next week, I'll publish a blog with the embedded video, and then also a link to that. But you can get them from Aaron, from the PowerShell virtual chapter of past site as well. Oh, okay,
Awesome.
yeah, I do see
And
that.
some comments from Teresa. Great presentation, Mike. And Max,
Thank you.
before Max left, Max Trinidad said, great session, a lot of good info, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah, Max Trinidad runs the Florida PowerShell user group. He's a PowerShell MVP, and he does videos similar to this also. So there's tons of free resources out there. So there's no excuse of why you can't learn PowerShell. And time is also not an excuse either. If you work out or something, walk on the treadmill, fire up a video while you're walking on the treadmill.
Yep. All right, great. Well, if that's it, lots of questions are just congratulations and great presentation comments. So I think that's it. We'll go ahead and end it here if that's good with you, and let people get back to their working day.
Sounds great. I appreciate you for having me on to present this, and hope everybody has a great day. Thank you.
All
Bye-bye.
right. See you later.